everyone! Today I'm going to be taking you through the process of sewing this bodice, which I've made using only scraps and leftovers from previous projects. It's inspired by the supportive petticoat bodices of the 16th century, though I did use my sewing machine, so I definitely wouldn't say it's completely historically accurate. It's also worth mentioning that part of the reason that I wanted to do this project is because I'm really interested in creating history bounding looks which don't require separate support garments. Personally, I'm just interested in way too many different time periods to be able to justify adding all the layers from all of them to my wardrobe. So I'm working on some practical workarounds. So without further ado, let's jump straight in. So I went ahead and got out the fabrics that I'm thinking about using. I will get into more detail as I'm actually putting things together, but basically the outside I want to be undyed linen, so I'm going to be piecing together all of these scraps. But first what I'm going to do is I'm going to starch this. This is a cotton actually. This is also left over from a project. It's weird shaped pieces. It's stained. But it'll be fine because it won't be seen. Probably using some sort of glue on it would be better than starching it, but I have starch, don't have glue, so that's what we're doing. After starching and ironing the cotton base fabric, I cut my bodice pattern pieces out. I left seam allowance only on the sides, front and strap edges. I wanted to focus on the construction process in this video since it's pretty different from modern garments, so I didn't go into a lot of detail about the pattern itself. I used a pattern from a previous project of mine, but I'll be covering this topic more in the future. So I did make a diagram which I will put on screen in just a second, which hopefully is a little bit more clear than this. So I just marked where I wanted support to go. I knew I wanted it to be roughly inspired by the Dorothea stays, though I'm going to be using Buckram in mine instead of boning, which is usually used for millinery, so hat making. But essentially it's a really loosely woven fabric with a lot of glue in it. I went ahead and marked the front and back edges here, so hopefully that makes it more clear. This is just half the bodice though, so just imagine the whole thing is mirrored along that center back line. All of the pieces will have an outer layer of linen and a lining layer, but not all of them will have all the support layers. So here I marked in green which pieces are cut from the starched cotton. That's the white fabric I was just cutting out. There won't be any of this in the straps since I want those to be softer. Next, I'll be adding in buckram layers, which are marked in red here. Like I mentioned a moment ago, the placement of this support is based on the Dorothea stays. And then the center front edge, which I planned to have 2 boning channels with eyelets between. I ended up using a slightly different layout, but this would work, which is why I've still included it here. So the buckram is stitched into all of my pieces. Could I have pad stitched this? Yes. Did I pad stitch this? No. I did curve them, Basically, I put it through the sewing machine, holding it in the curve. Okay, super quick fitting because for some reason I was worried that the pattern had magically changed and it wasn't going to fit. It does fit, it's fine. You didn't really miss anything. All I did was stitch on some lacing panels and stitch up the sides, pin the sleeve back on. I have to say I'm quite happy with how the Buckram is working. The one thing I'm going to change is I'm going to take the back up a little. You can see from the side that it actually angles down a little bit at the back, and it does crease a bit as well because of that. But everything else is good. At this point I change the lower back edge and I iron all of my linen scraps. And then my next few videos just kind of turn into jumbled rants because I couldn't actually decide how I wanted to put everything together, specifically around the front edge. I was concerned that I needed a facing to add boning channels, but I didn't want to add too many layers of fabric, so instead I add another layer of Buckram, which is thicker than a layer of fabric. Yeah, I know. I do still add a single piece of synthetic whalebone on the center front edge by folding over the seam allowance and using it as a boning channel. And then I finally start adding my linen layer by stitching it down on the inside and then wrapping it around the center front edge to the outside. I did have to unpick part of this in a moment though, so I'm not sure it was really the best way. I think I might add a bit of cotton tape to the waistline just to have a bit of straight grain reinforcement. The tape is going to be in separate pieces so that there's some overlap at the seams. That's kind of like leaving seam allowance in there, so that just means if I do ever decide to alter this, it'll make my life easier. I ended up doing this off camera because I was just flipping it over really often and it wasn't really clear what I was doing, but basically I couldn't get the eyelet holes big enough, so what I did is I unpicked the linen that I had stitched down on the inside to expose the buckram. That's because the glue in the buckram is water soluble, so if you get it wet it softens. It does harden again afterwards, that's how you block hats, but basically I just got each of these a little bit wet and then went back in with my awl, and they're bigger now. I thought I'd just do a quick close-up to show you what I'm doing and how I'm doing it. You can actually kind of see how thick this fabric is if you look at the eyelets from the side. So I'm stitching with a linen thread which I'm coating in beeswax. I'm wearing a thimble, which I would definitely recommend, especially if you're going through this many layers. I would say you really can't do it without it. And I'm also using pliers to pull the needle through. So you want to start with the thread coming through to the outside. So then the needle goes through the hole from the back to the front. And you want the thread to be looped around your needle like this. And that's it. You just pull that tight, go all the way around. I do keep opening the hole back up as I'm doing it with my, I'm using a tapered awl just to make sure it stays round. And the back just looks like that. One side of eyelets is done. Unsurprisingly, it is not easy to stitch eyelets through 2 layers of buckram. In any case, that took me 3 hours, so I'm going to take a break from that now, and I'm going to start piecing together the linen, and I'll do the other sides later. I try to keep the grain line consistent as I do this, but other than that, this process is really just trial and error to see which pieces fit together. I sew them together by machine, and I'm pressing them as I go, and I just make sure that I have some extra fabric around the edges of all the pieces, since I'll be folding this outer linen layer around to the inside of the bodice. Just checking in again, I've done about 19 hours on the project now. Yesterday I did finish piecing together the linen, and this morning I've just been sewing the eyelets on the other side. I've got a couple still to do, and then I'll be able to move on to stitching the linen down. The eyelets are finally done. It did take me about 6 hours in the end. Obviously, I won't include all that in the video, that would just be horribly boring to watch. But there we go. They are offset because this is going to be spiral laced. It's really not wanting to focus right now, so it's going to do that, basically. So now I can move on to attaching the rest of the linen down, and then hopefully that means that it's gonna be finished soon-ish. So the goal with pinning on the linen is to make sure that the outer layer is smooth when it's worn. So because this is curving around the body, the outer layer naturally needs just a little bit more. It needs to be just a tiny bit bigger, and pinning it on a curve is the easiest way to do that. So I used my pressing ham, but you could also do it on a mannequin. You can actually kind of see that it's a little bit loose when it's laying flat, but that's totally fine. The goal is just for it to be smooth when it's actually being worn. The next step is folding under the edge of the linen. I'm not doing each section the same way, so I'll bring back my diagram. Keep in mind that the center front edge is already folded under, and the center back is cut in one piece, so there isn't actually a raw edge there. So I'm starting with the edges that have buckram, which I marked in yellow here. I'm not actually sewing these down, because at this point I was so sick of sewing through buckram that I couldn't bear the thought of it. So instead I used some Bondaweb, which is an iron-on glue layer, basically. It's the same stuff as iron-on hemming tape. I'm not worried about this coming unstuck, because once the lining is sewn in, it will actually help hold everything in place. I did stitch that very front edge under the eyelets, but I realised that my thread matched too well for you to actually be able to see it in the video, so I do switch colours in a moment. The rest of the edges that I've marked with blue on the diagram here get folded under and whip stitched down. I don't sew down the center front neckline yet, or the edges that will have straps attached. I used some red and turquoise thread on sections of mine, so it's a little bit easier to see. I'm hoping at least one of these colours will be clear to everyone. These stitches don't go through the outer layer of linen, and they'll be covered by the lining, which is why it doesn't really matter what colour they are. I'm also sewing together the side seams in my linen layer at this point, just using a smaller whip stitch. And then I can take out all of the pins and move on to the straps. Okay, so I went a little bit into autopilot mode and I sewed the straps all the way to the end. I actually should have left a gap, so I'm unpicking that now. This is my autopilot version, so this is just all sewn together with all the seam allowance folded down. It's totally like fine and functional, it's just too bulky for my taste. So what I actually wanted to do was this, which is basically the same but without sewing the lining down. So machine sewn, then seam allowances turned out. This is why I didn't sew this edge down earlier. This is the center front neckline edge, and I would have had to cut into this corner to be able to sew these down independently, which you don't need to do because they all fall down in the end. So now that all gets folded down, the strap seam allowance gets folded up, and the strap lining gets folded over, and I'm just going to hand stitch that down. That means that the bulk is evenly spread, and the bodice will have lining coming up to that edge as well. There's definitely easier ways to do this. I think this is probably a little overcomplicated. It's basically a similar effect to if I had just whip stitched the finished edges together. But for some reason I decided I'm doing it this way, so, you know, here we are. Actually, I might let the lining of the strap extend down into the bodice, both so that I don't have to fold both of these corners into the strap, and so that I can potentially secure it to the bodice here and have that be like an extra anchor point. The only thing that I have left to do is sew in a lining. So the outside is completely finished off, and the lining is basically just going in the same way that I did the linen on the outside. So I probably won't show too much of it just because it feels a little redundant, but the one big difference is I'm just using the selvage edge of this because it has a nice narrow selvage as the front edge. So I'm just going to whip stitch this straight to the other linen. I will cut around the pattern pieces, and then I will just turn under the edges and whip stitch down, basically the same way that I whip stitched this linen down. Okay, quick wrap up. All in all, I'm very happy with everything. The bodice is definitely really comfortable because it's so short. It doesn't restrict movement at all, so I think it's going to make a really good base for some day-to-day pieces, which is excellent. The bodice took me about 36 hours all in all. I do keep really close track of all my projects. I'm not sure whether that's something that people are interested in seeing, but let me know. I can definitely include more of that. And yeah, that's it. Thank you everyone for watching, and I'll see you next time.